Warm welcome to this webinar today. My name is Guido Baldi, and I'm very happy that Peter Obinger is joining us today to talk about EU industrial policy in a changing global economy. Peter is an economist at the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber and an expert for industrial policy. Peter, we are very happy to have you in our webinar, and now the floor is yours.
Very much for the introduction, Guido. Then let's head right in. I'd like to start with a short outline. So at the beginning, I'd like to give a general introduction on industrial policy or IP and on the economic rationale behind it as well. We'll talk a bit about how the resurgence of IP has shaped the global economic landscape. And I will also talk about how industrial policies have changed themselves, and also with regards to the motives that government have for pursuing them, and also the instruments that they use in modern IP. And finally, I'd like to talk about what it all means for the EU. So what is IP? Well, in a broad sense, I'd say industrial policy includes all government measures that deliberately aim to shape the sectoral and structural technological structure of the economy, therefore also the allocation of resources across activities. This can include horizontal instruments like R&D or skills or infrastructure, or it can include targeted or vertical instruments like subsidies, procurement, or trade measures. In the past, economists have been tended to be skeptical of industrial policy based on the risk of creating inefficiencies. For example, if governments have an information deficiency, they will be worse at deciding which sectors the economy should focus on than the market would be. And there's also a fear of a race to the bottom because of mutual retaliation. But recently, attitudes have shifted quite strongly, I think, and this relates to the presence of market failures like climate change, political economy considerations, like a concern for domestic producers and domestic workers, but also dynamic externalities like the presence of learning by doing effects, specifically in technologically innovative or infant sectors. So it's definitely true that IP has made a big comeback in recent years, which I would say is mainly caused by the re-emergence of a lot of geostrategic rationales. There was the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and they have made a variety of supply chain vulnerabilities quite obvious, I think, and also popularized the concept of weaponized interdependence, where governments try to use the supply chain vulnerabilities of their opponents to gain a certain strategic advantage. And following this realization, governments now try to improve security of supply by using industrial policies and to reduce their exposure to certain choke points or to coercion by those choke points. And they also try to preserve some defense-relevant production capabilities. There's also a general sense, I think, that the multilateralism anchored around the WTO has somehow failed to address many of the issues regarding IP. The EU also called for WTO reform quite recently, and the US is on another level, of course, but the trade representative, Jameson Greer, has called the WTO an economic suicide pact that provides like cover for state capitalist systems to foster deindustrialization on their more liberal trade partners.
Just so very briefly, sometimes we cannot hear you that well. It's okay. Perhaps your microphone is.
Thanks for the info, Guido. Maybe I try to speak just louder, or maybe.
Perhaps. Or
is this better now?
Yeah, I think now it's better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I used the webcam. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's important. Now over to the the economic rationales for IP. There's this common criticism targeted at economists that they are like these ardent defenders of free trade and they have nothing really to say about geopolitics besides the usual quips about like not to interfere in free trade too much. But while economists, I think, do like free trade as a general principle, there's also a large body of work tackling the question when and how to deviate like from traditional free trade. And these reasons are generally connected to the presence of externalities. For example, if maintaining domestic production capabilities creates benefits that are not taken into account by markets and by market pricing, then governments should in fact engage in IP, at least if those benefits are large enough. Moreover, such externalities and cross-border spillovers also sometimes are positive. Just think of lower prices for consumers, and an especially spectacular example is the decline of prices in certain clean tech goods, especially PV panels, that are to a large degree a result of past industrial policies by Germany, but also China in recent years. And it is a fair question. Why not let like foreign taxpayers subsidize your own domestic consumption, especially when it helps you to beat like some other problem like climate change as well? And here I think economists basically offer three reasons. First, like political economy is, of course, an important consideration that has come back into the limelight in recent years, especially because of the first China shock literature that showed quite clearly how like a sudden rise in imports can drive certain industries out of business. And if those industries are like concentrated locally, and disruptions this causes can be more intense than the headline drop of employment on a macroeconomic level suggests. And even though in principle we probably shouldn't single out disruptions due to trade as opposed to other kinds of disruptions, for example, stemming from technological shocks, but in a political economy sense, they do differ a bit. The electorate kind of feels differently about jobs that are outsourced than jobs that become maybe obsolete because of technological change. Then there are also externalities in production. If there are strong learning by doing effects, they can dynamically create a comparative advantage in a targeted sector. And if learning spillovers are strong, markets may, of course, underinvest in entering that industry. This again relates to the classic infant industry argument for industrial policy. And there is evidence that while for mature sectors like shipbuilding, for example, IP mainly does take market share. For infant industries or newer sectors like renewables, for example, it can actually create market size. And also an important factor is the production and trade are nowadays organized in global value chains. This means that spillovers created by industrial policies are maybe stronger than they have been in the past. And of course, like the most important market failure, probably at least for governments, is the effect on national security. If other governments or economists try to use IP to gain a strategic choke point, it can be justified to respond with your own industrial policy or make at least sure that you have a certain amount of domestic capabilities so that it can't be used against you later. So I think for Europe, industrial policy is always very closely tied to the topic of competitiveness and growth. I mean, the Draghi report, the EU's most comprehensive or cohesive blueprint for an industrial policy, was commissioned precisely because of a perceived lack in competitiveness in Europe and the associated growth shortfall. And to an extent, I think it could have been expected that Europe had like a couple of bad years if you consider the shocks that have hit the European economy. I mean, there was COVID and there was the massive negative terms of trade shock from the energy shock and the following monetary tightening, and also like a more moderate but still fiscal tightening. But I think last year in 2025, it became evident that those three had mostly ended or maybe even reversed, and there would be some pickup in growth. And I think that's what we see now. But at least until now, let's see what happens in the Middle East. But yeah, but even still, growth is expected to remain moderate in the Eurozone. The IMF expects 1.3% growth in 2026. And there's a deep sense in Europe that growth still underperforms. And I think, so even though the direct shocks to the EU have mostly dissipated, the EU's growth model remains under pressure. And I think we see that clearly from these two charts here. On the left, we see like a frying pan chart that shows the EU's domestic demand curve. And on the right, we see the EU's export performance. And at least since the great financial crisis, we can see that growth in Europe was to a large extent reliant on external demand, while internal demand has moved further and further away from the pre-crisis trend with each shock that has been hitting the EU. So if global trade uncertainty remains high, which I think can be expected, and if globalization will indeed go into a reverse gear, growth will need to be supplied increasingly by internal demand in Europe. So now I'd like to go over to the shifting global landscape. I want to start with some data from the Geoeconomic Monitor, which is assembled by Clayton et al. It shows how many companies report that their businesses or their management decisions are influenced by geopolitically motivated economic measures, which can be further broken down by instruments. So for tariffs, we see a significant peak in the first phase of the US-China trade war in 2018, and a very strong spike in the first quarter of 2025 due to the return of the tariff man. It's in fact the largest spike in the sample. Then for exports, for export controls and sanctions, there's a clear peak from 2022 onwards in connection with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And interestingly, while sanctions have somewhat receded as an influence, export controls have remained highly relevant. And I think we can also see the signs of this uncertainty finally making a mark on global macroeconomic indicators. People have for a long time said that or predicted the death of globalization, or at least an unwinding of globalization. But the data until very recently didn't really show a decline. I mean, we can very clearly see the phases of hyperglobalization and slow globalization, using like the share of total global trade in percent of GDP. And during the era of liberalization, a significant increase in trade intensity has occurred. So the trade ratio rose from around 32% in the late 1980s to over 60% until the great financial crisis. And since then, it has stagnated or fallen a bit to 57% in 2023. But the latest IMF forecast does expect a gradual decline of global trade to 54% of GDP by 2030. So geopolitical uncertainty and associated conflicts have had a noticeable effect on international trade relations. And I think this is ushering a phase of realignment or geopolitical realignment, and we can see a restructuring of global trade in a sense. And in recent years, there emerged a variety of attempts to measure the use of industrial and trade policy instruments. And one such attempt is the so-called Trade Policy Activity Index. The TPA tries to cover the entire spectrum of trade policy measures, from tariffs to subsidies to export controls. And it makes it possible to visualize structural breaks and also cyclical movements. For almost a decade after the great financial crisis, global trade policy was relatively stable and activity was low. Even the first US-China trade war didn't really make that much of a dent, as we can see. And it just goes to show the much more restrained nature of the first Trump administration, at least when it came to trade policy, I think. But from 2019 onwards, there's a clear structural break. And the index rose sharply and has been on a sustained upward trend ever since. So driving events like COVID-19 and Ukraine and ongoing geopolitical tensions have all contributed to this, I would say. So all in all, we see a clear geopolitical intensification. So let's talk about the motives governments provide when they pursue industrial policies, and also the instruments that they use. So let's start with the incidence of industrial policy measures. This chart is based on data from the New Industrial Policy Observatory, and it shows the number of annually active IP measures for each of the tracked categories of industrial policy measures. So the number of industrial policy measures in force worldwide continues to rise quite steadily, and crucially, it does not really dissipate after shocks dissipate. This is, I think, a recurring feature of modern IP. It goes up in crisis, but it doesn't go down afterwards. A bit like the gold price has behaved recently, maybe. So I think it is safe to claim that industrial policy interventions are increasingly influencing the competitiveness situation of export companies and also international markets. And regarding instruments, in January last year, we can see that subsidies still remain the dominant industrial policy instrument, accounting for over 70% of all measures recorded. Important here, I think, is also that counts, like the number of policies doesn't equal like the volume or the money amount that they use. So these are policy counts, which could be imperfect since it only captures the number of policies, of course, and not the size, and might miss also subnational policies, which might be especially relevant for countries like China with strong inter-provincial competition. So now I think you can see it. Okay. So it is also important to look at regional variation, I think, and on the volumes of industrial policy measures. Industrial policy is something that is practiced quite differently around the world, and it's shaped by the different institutional setups, and it can be viewed as part of a country's growth model in a way, with the goals and instruments determined by political structures and institutions. So in terms of volume, I think it's quite obvious that China ranks significantly higher than major EU or OECD countries in international comparisons. Depending on the methodology we use, we can see that the ratio ranges from around 3 to 4 times to up to 9 times in volume. So quite a large range. And industrial policies in general are a long-standing centerpiece of Chinese economic policy, I would say. And they implemented an array of tools such as cash subsidies and below-market credit and below-market land and stuff like this. But the 4 dominating instruments that China uses are cash subsidies, tax benefits, and subsidized credit and land. And especially subsidies are really universal in China. We see that over 99% of listed companies received direct state subsidies in 2022, for example. But I think it's also important to note that all these estimates are maybe to be treated more like informed guesses than hard numbers, because there's a lot of measurement uncertainty involved in calculating them. Official information on size and effects is almost non-available. And the quantification of implicit support measures like below market credit rates are almost always measured model based. So of course they're always up to debate to a certain point. So these issues mean that the real scope of IP could be even larger than what these more serious measurement attempts show. At least for Europe, measurement should be in theory more accurate, as it mostly uses state aid, which is more reportable than China's heavier use of below market credit. So budgetary tools like this should generally be more transparent and a bit less distortionary than the indirect tools that China relies on. So regarding the motives, I think until 2020, interventions in the US and other Western countries were primarily justified by climate change, also competitiveness, and at the third place, securing business locations. But this changed from 2022 onwards, and there has been a significant increase in justifications based on national security or geopolitical motives, something that's particularly strong or clear in the US. So in the last 2 years, 50% of industrial policy measures in the US explicitly cite national security or geopolitical considerations. So data shows a clear shift in motives from 2020 away from competitiveness and climate mitigation towards security and resilience concerns. This turn is not only a Western phenomenon; it can also be seen in the rest of the world. So now I'd like to talk what this all means for the EU. So the EU has been hit by multiple shocks recently. So there's Russia's turn away from a potential partner to becoming a military predator, and the resulting price shock that the EU experienced regarding energy. Then there was a significant reversal during the last year of decades of gradual liberalization of global trade, also related to President Trump's extensive linkage of security and economic policies in his foreign policy. But crucially for Europe, I think there's also the rise of China's external surplus and its explicit policy to dominate as many, or at least 10 key strategic sectors globally, as written down in their Made in China 2025 policy. So I believe in the absence of US trade chaos, the spectacular rise of China's surplus would be the biggest topic right now in international economics and especially for Europe. Since one could even argue that all the other shocks are also fundamentally intertwined with China's industrial policy initiatives. I mean, Russia would not be able to wage its war in this way if it wouldn't have access to Chinese dual-use goods. Trump maybe would not have been elected if the political economy fallout from the first China shock would not have happened. And maybe even the WTO would be in a better standing if China would have been left out, would have left outside the organization, and this friction between national security and free trade wouldn't have arisen in this strong way as Mario Draghi, for example, alluded to in a recent speech. So I think it is very important, if one talks about European industrial policy, to also talk about China's industrial policy experience. So on the left here, we see that China's trade surplus in goods in US dollar terms has really exploded in recent years. Ordinarily, one would use the current account, but China does cook the books a bit here, so we use the customs data. Since it is more easily cross-checked with data from its trade partners. So China's trade balance in manufactured goods especially is important given the political and strategic importance of manufacturing that we already talked about. And even though most workers are now not employed in the service sector anymore, I think it's safe to say that we have seen a deindustrializing effect from China's surplus, and it is enormous. It's a share of world GDP, as the right chart is showing. It's completely unprecedented. I mean, Germany and Japan, they also had big surpluses in the past, but in China is just much bigger in terms of the global GDP. It was never this huge. So I think it's clear now China sells a lot more manufactured goods to the world than it buys, and it's clear that this has had a deindustrializing effect on the rest of the world. So there is this misconception that like a a really huge trade balance is a sign of economic strength. In other words, people often assume that like a productive, hardworking nation will run a surplus, while a lagging or uncompetitive or I don't know lazy economy will have a deficit. But if anything, I think the past has shown that trade surplus is often a sign of underlying economic weakness. I mean, China's economy surely isn't stagnant, like maybe Germany's or Austria's a couple of years, but growth has slowed. And China does have a major structural problem, and that's that consumer spending didn't really keep up with economic growth. And the reason for this is basically the very high savings rates of the household sector, resulting from demographic changes that came from the one-child policy and also a relatively weak social safety net. As we can see on the left chart as well, there's also a still ongoing housing crisis that also contributes to this higher savings rate. Now, if China didn't have the option of running a trade surplus, low consumer spending would probably keep the Chinese economy persistently depressed unless it was offset by higher investment spending. And China did have very high investment spending for sure. It's way higher than like in the EU or in the US. But with growth slowing and profitable investment opportunities becoming rarer, it has not been enough to balance the high savings, which has resulted in this huge explosion of the surplus. So in a way, China's leadership has in effect chosen to run like massive surpluses rather than raising the consumption or the living standards of its own population. So as we've seen, while the fundamental cause of China's trade surplus is an excess of domestic savings over domestic investment opportunities, China's exporters and also importers feel this imbalance primarily through the exchange rate. So a weak exchange rate, other things equal, of course, mean that Chinese production costs measured in other currencies are lower. This makes Chinese companies, of course, more competitive in export markets, while making foreign companies less competitiveness on the Chinese market. And I think this is also where the energy price shock in Europe relates a bit. Both have led to a real appreciation of the euro and the price level, as seen in the second chart here, which had the effect that European industry lost a lot of price competitiveness, and while China's industry has gained it simultaneously. Now, of course, the weak yuan is not the only way that China incentivizes trade surpluses. It also uses this already discussed wide array of industrial policies. So in effect, I think by foregoing domestic consumption, China is relying on those huge surpluses to compensate for its underconsumption, while its exchange rate that is set by the state to a large extent, and also its industrial policies are designed to enable those specific surpluses. So for Europe, this has translated to a loss of demand from China, as well as from a general demand shortfall caused by the relatively cheap and abundant Chinese supply, sort of pressing onto the global markets to escape this oversupplied and weak domestic market. And this has especially affected the German industry, as it was probably the Western economy that was most integrated or most reliant on Chinese demand. So German exports to China are now back to levels not seen since the early 2010s with respect to GDP, while China's own GDP has grown strongly, of course, since then. But we also see that the recent sharp decline has actually coincided with kind of weak Chinese GDP growth, at least in nominal terms, which again points to China's domestic weakness and its undervalued currency. And of course, this loss in export markets also affects countries around Germany that are highly integrated in its manufacturing supply chain. So if we look at the automotive supply chain, one would probably highlight Austria and Slovakia and Czechia in those countries. And the European or the global automotive supply chain is probably the sector that's most affected by this new second China shock as well. Chinese car exports have surged from 1 million units before the pandemic to over 7 million units in the last 12 months, leaving a net surplus of around 6.5 million. While simultaneously, EU car exports to China have fallen by more than half since the start of 2023. In the last few years, a bit of a bright spot for European producers was still the US market. The US had very high tariffs on Chinese EVs, or still has, which gave EU producers a competitive advantage here, while the US competitive market grew quite strongly because of its own industrial policy initiatives like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Unfortunately, this changed with the Liberation Day tariffs and the repeal of most of the tax incentives that were introduced by the IRA last year. So Europe, in effect, now faces a double hit to its export demand from two of its most important trade partners. But Chinese car exports are probably just the tip of the spear, so to speak. Other economically important sectors, such as machine building and chemicals, are closely following. In effect, we see across the board that the kinds of goods that both China and Europe export are becoming more and more similar, which highlights increased competition. So between 2010 and 2023, the export similarity index based on a 3-digit trade data has increased by around 10 percentage points, and is also markedly higher than between China and Japan or China and the UK. Moreover, there's increasingly less overlap between the kinds of goods that China imports with the goods that the Eurozone wants to export. What China does still import are commodities, and those are naturally not the kind of goods that resource-poor Europe specialized in, and probably won't specialize in the future. So lastly, we can also see that Europe's dependence on Chinese imports has spread to more and more types of goods in recent years, reflecting also the increasingly one-sided trade relationship that has developed between China and the Eurozone. So summarizing China's industrial policy success, I would point to a combination of supportive industrial policy measures. It has also fundamentally relied on its large domestic market that allows it to reap increasing returns to scale and offer strong competition, in the case of China, especially on an interprovincial level. China's success also relied, I think, on importing advanced foreign technologies, which it has incentivized by linking access to its market to technology transfer by foreign firms. I would also argue that China's success is also based on a bit of luck, maybe. The emergence of the electro-technological stack has allowed Chinese firms to leapfrog many Western rivals in EVs, in clean tech and stuff like this. And these new technologies also tend to be somewhat more similar to each other than technologies have been in the past, with many of them relying on similar things like a battery, a semiconductor, and a bit of software maybe. And because of this similarity, it has allowed for increased spillovers across firms. And it has also allowed producers that have been successful in one kind of product to easily expand to other related sectors. So vertical integration tends to be higher in those firms in China today than it is in many European competitors. So I would say it is no coincidence that the world's largest car manufacturer today, BYD, has started out as a battery maker. So lastly, I would like to talk a bit about what Europe has done, or maybe what should it do in response. I would say that the industrial policy response from Europe has been essentially like three-pronged. First, there has been an external dimension relating to a more active trade policy. Second, there's the internal dimension focusing on leveraging the single market. And third, is the sort of a more horizontal governance and financing dimension. So starting with trade policy, there has been a general realization that there's a trade-off between trade openness and industrial policy that is hard to avoid in practice. Negative spillovers that threaten strategic industries do require trade defense measures or maybe one's own industrial policy initiatives, but those inevitably also affect other trade partners that are not primarily targeted. So while it remains essential to manage this trade-off, I think, So to manage the trade-off between defending one's national interest, but also still reaping the gains from trade as much as possible in a world where security and trade are this closely interlinked and pursued in tandem, especially by the two great powers, trade ceases to be automatically win-win in every situation. And the EU has, in fact, used its trade tools much more assertively in recent years. For example, in 2024, EU imposed countervailing duties on the import of Chinese EVs. I also think there is a question whether those targeted trade defense measures are enough if the challenge is really structural, or if they simply lead to a sort of whack-a-mole game that leaves the structural imbalances mostly untouched. On the other hand, there has been a renewed push in Europe to expand markets and to diversify Europe's trade partners. The EU has recently signed a deal with Mercosur after more than 25 years, I think. It also signed a deal with India, which was not expected a few years ago. There was a deal with Indonesia, and I think the Commission is also now quite close to striking a deal with Australia, which is hopefully coming pretty soon. Yeah, but as always with IP and trade defense, I think it's just important to be very strategic with it. The choice of intervention should, of course, always follow a right tool for the job approach. But it should remain strategically focused, regularly adapted to new information, and if possible, limited in duration. So the goal should always be not to unduly limit the incentives for innovation that come from competition and leave opportunities open to improve policy design later. Because this is, I think, a hallmark of all successful industrial policy initiatives in the past, maybe going back to the US New Deal even. Continuous adaptation of industrial policy in response to what works and what does not. So double down on successes, but let failures fail, which is of course the hardest part to get right, unfortunately. And especially because it is so difficult, economists have probably rightly been hesitant in recommending such an approach. But in the context of Europe today and how it's struck by Chinese overcapacities in certain sectors, I think it is increasingly difficult to see how certain industries that are both vital to innovation and resilience in Europe can be retained without at least some degree of protectionism. But I also do think that the EU is on the way to get the approach broadly right. Make new trade deals, but in the meantime, try to use your available flexibilities to defend against negative spillovers, while also maybe on an international level, push for reform initiatives for the multilateral system, try WTO reform. If nothing comes of it, at least it gets you political cover to do the measures you need to do. And make it clear to your trade partners that this is about tackling negative spillovers from the industrial policies of other countries and not necessarily a mercantilist policy. So over to the second point. In a tougher geoeconomic environment, the EU's biggest strategic asset still is the single market. It is what the EU has the most control over too. Europe cannot decide what China does, it cannot decide what it buys, and it cannot decide what third markets buy as well or what they import. But what they can influence is the economic opportunities at home. And unfortunately for the EU, there still exist a lot of avenues, I think, to improve the internal market. I mean, there's capital markets where Europe has long had a saving surplus itself, but because of the fragmented capital markets, those savings were not channeled into European assets, but instead went into the US market. And also service trade still offers immense opportunities. Services is probably where the single market remains the most fragmented. And the IMF in 2024 estimated that those frictions in the trade of services amount to a tariff equivalence of up to 144%, which is, of course, a major drag on productivity and the diffusion of innovation within Europe. Of course, energy prices play a role here, high and above all, volatile energy prices are, of course, a structural disadvantage for Europe. And their priorities in the last few years, at least on an industrial policy perspective, have been to promote cross-border investments and to allow for faster permitting so that the advances in the price of clean energy can actually translate into lower prices for consumers as well. And I think this is a good example where Europe can actually benefit from certain industrial policies, especially from China. And of course, there's also an increased discussion about made in Europe regulations. As we have seen, Chinese overcapacities are hitting EU industry basically everywhere, in China and in third markets, and increasingly also on the European market. So the Commission yesterday announced its Industrial Accelerator Act, that is basically the EU's answer to Chinese industrial policy, I would say. So the EU now wants to push back by steering more EU demand toward EU production by linking public procurement and other support programs to local content, or in some cases, low carbon criteria. In practice, this will mean that firms in a narrow set of strategic sectors would need to localize production in Europe if they want to qualify for public contracts or subsidies in the future. Important is that the sector list that the Commission has proposed is relatively tight. I think that follows German red lines, and I think that's hopeful for the next year when it's going to be finalized. And it also has a rule that lets allies that compete fairly also participate in it, which is also quite important, I think. So if this is done right, I think it could be a big step towards Draghi's vision of a common and coherent and unified European industrial policy. And finally, when it comes to governance and financing, the EU still needs the tools, I think, to incentivize or in some cases enforce industrial policy. With its current setup, it lacks either the sticks and the carrots to do this. This is why a reformed EU budget in the next multi-annual frame is also very important, I think, because it provides the means, the financial means to incentivize this unified industrial policy, and also pools financial resources towards a limited number of priorities as opposed to the past. Because what has held back Europe, I think, was never an inability to see or grasp the problems that face it. The problem was always like a lack of unity on how to address these problems. And I think in this regard, at least the last year and months have provided some hopeful signs. And lastly, I think also in the current geopolitical environment, and a renewed urgency that has come up to make progress on policy initiatives that have been long stalled. This has also increased the attractiveness of coalitions of the willing, or like a Europe of different speeds. Namely, that smaller groups of countries push ahead in certain areas where like a union-wide 27-country consensus is hard or impossible to come by. What's important here from an EU perspective, I think, is that those initiatives are set up in a way that they allow for EU member states to join later up when they see that the measures are ultimately beneficial to them. So we should be careful not to fracture the EU with those. So some final remarks. So there has a debate in the EU whether it should focus on its competitiveness drive, which mostly means like lowering energy costs, simplification, deepening the single market, stuff like this, versus demand side measures such as local content requirements. I think this is a wrong dichotomy in a way. What the EU really needs is like an all of the above policy approach, but it is a matter of calibration, of course. And I do think that the EU is well placed to find like a golden path between protectionism and openness to trade. The EU is highly unlikely to implement local content measures or other industrial policies in general as extensively as China has done so in the past. And I think China also proved that maybe such measures can also be quite good for economic growth. So I think that's also hopeful. And lastly, maybe EU action against like the second China shock and global imbalances in general can also lead to a newer and more stable and even more balanced economy. Trade defense measures on China would, for example, force Chinese companies to move their factories abroad to other countries like Vietnam or Indonesia, or maybe some other country that is in need of industrialization. And this would, of course, help those countries industrialize, since it's hard to do so if China continues to dominate more and more industries and only buys commodities. Yeah, thanks a lot.